Your phone system is already touching protected health information. Here's what that means. Most healthcare focused voice providers, cloud communication providers, unified communication providers think HIPAA only kicks in when something goes wrong, but they're already behind. There's a version of the HIPAA conversation that goes something like this. We're just carrying calls. We're a conduit. That's not our problem. And the thinking goes back to like the 1990s law when caller ID wasn't even invented. This version is wrong, and increasingly, it's expensive to be wrong about it. Or if you're a Broadworks or a NetSapiens or Alianza or 2600 Hertz or Porta One, any kind of provider hosting any kind of UCaaS platform, any kind of cloud communication platform, your customers, if they include doctors' offices, clinics, home health agencies, behavioral health services, you're already in contact with protected health information. The question isn't whether HIPAA applies to you, it's whether you've built your service to handle it. Here's the moment that stops most providers cold. Even caller ID can be considered to contain protected health information. Imagine you've got caller ID and your customer is getting a call from Cancer Centers of America. Well, that's actually exposing health information about your customer. It provides personally identifiable information about the callers who are potentially calling into or receiving calls from healthcare services. Now think about that. A patient calls their psychiatrist's office, your system logs that call. The caller ID, the name and the number is now in your CDR. It's in your logs. That's protected health information. So caller ID, as primitive as that is right at the hairy edge of the kinds of services where you have to start to think about executing a business associate agreement. The Department of Health and Human Services built a safe haven doctrine for voice service providers, one that says carriers can do basic 1995 telephone features without signing a BAA, and the medical provider can buy services from them. But that safe haven is narrow, and most UC providers have already left it. The moment your platform stores voicemail, logs caller names and CDRs, or handles anything beyond a plain audio call, the obligation shifts. It's up to the healthcare provider, the covered entity, to buy services from a provider that will make real security and privacy guarantees. If that's you, you need a business associates agreement. And if you've signed one, now you've got to back it up. And that happens a lot. Sometimes the compliance team doesn't even know that the sales team has actually executed a BAA. They just thought it was normal. It's just something they have to sign. But now they're committed to actually provide a high level of service. So one way to think about this is like an escalating liability stack. Now, I'm not a lawyer and this is not legal advice, but you can think of it roughly like this way as you go to your legal counsel. UC compliance can be thought of as 3 layers, where the basic layer, tier 1, is basic voice calls. It's PSTN audio only. There's no caller ID. There's no voicemail. And so this is covered by the safe haven doctrine. There's no BAA required. So we're 1995, right? We don't have any caller ID. We don't have any voicemail. We barely have anything. Tier 2 would be the next level up. It's voicemail, it's CDRs, it's caller name. So now you're talking about storing and processing protected health information. If BAA is required, you need encryption at rest. For example, for that voicemail, you need access controls to see who can access the logs and the CDRs. And you need audit logging. You need to know who's accessing what. So when somebody logs in and looks at the CDRs and they see that Jane Doe received a call from Cancer Centers of America, you need to know who accessed that log. And then there's call recording and transcription. Full HIPAA technical safeguards are required at this level. So now we've actually got real information, potentially between healthcare providers and the customers or patients. Where you process and store the data becomes critical. So most providers, cloud communication providers, are already operating at tier 2 or above for every healthcare customer they serve, whether they formalize that or not. Now, their obligation is on the healthcare customer, the covered entity, to actually execute BAAs appropriately. So if they've never asked you to execute a BAA, then you don't have a promise to them that you're actually going to provide services. But there's a real risk compound when we cross over to call transcription. Adding call transcription is where things get materially more complex and where most of the cloud-based solutions are creating a hidden compliance problem. When you get transcriptions of calls and meetings, clients become much more aware of the risk than they were if they were merely storing recordings. Recordings are really hard to access. Somebody has to sit and listen. Once it's text and it's searchable, everything people said is suddenly visible. The shift from recordings to transcripts is a risk multiplier. A recording is like a box of tapes. A transcript is a searchable corpus of everything your customer staff has ever said on the phone. The same protected health information is present in both, but the transcript makes it instantly accessible in a way that creates real additional exposure. Again, this is not legal advice. This is just pragmatic analysis, and I've read a lot of the enforcement actions of the Office of Civil Rights. This matters especially for how you source your transcription. If you're routing call audio to a third-party cloud transcription service, even a major one, you've created a new BAA obligation. The provider needs to be willing to sign a BAA for that service, but many won't. Most of the cloud-based call transcription offerings available to service providers right now simply don't pass muster for cybersecurity compliance in healthcare contexts. The answer is to keep transcription inside infrastructure you control. If you can run your own servers with your own compute, you don't have to execute a BAA with an external party. You possess the audio, you possess the transcription, your own environments, and you retain the controls. So what you actually have to do, largely from a technical perspective, if you're signing a business associates agreement or thinking about it, here's what responsible providers implement. These are not theoretical requirements. These are the things that come up in real audits. So one of the big ones is TLS and SRTP in transit. So you need to encrypt your signaling and your audio across every link you don't operate. If customers connect over the public internet, they get TLS with strong encryption standard. You got to watch that encryption format because that changes and there are standards. There's some that are old and they're not really workable. There's some that are new that are workable. That's a moving target. You've got to meet your encryption standard to the standards that the federal government is managing. You don't need to encrypt necessarily between your Broadworks and your SBC and a private internal link because that's considered a trusted enclave, but everything outside your perimeter goes. You need AES 256 at rest. To be honest, like AES 256 is considered the coin of the realm, the standard reference. Voicemail, call recordings, transcripts, CDRs containing caller name, all encrypted. Keys need to be stored entirely separate from the data. So you need to be able to show an auditor that your keys are not just there in a script right next to the data. You need compartmentalized access. That means no shared accounts, nobody logging in as BW admin or root. You need role-based access where support staff should have the minimum access needed, and ideally a customer lockbox model where tenant data requires explicit permissions to access. You know, companies like Microsoft, Zoom Phone, RingCentral, they've implemented versions of this, and cloud communications providers in general need to provide this kind of thing in order to do BAAs. You need audit logs of the log accesses. It's not enough just to have logs like of the calls. You need to have logs of who accessed the logs. So you need to know if a particular employee accessed the call logs for a particular customer. CDRs and troubleshooting data really need to go to a separate system, a SIEM, or something like Elasticsearch, Kibana. It's a really common approach for these deployments, basically where we're taking those logs, we're taking that troubleshooting data, and we're sending it somewhere else. And then we're not logging in and accessing it with a less command and grep. We're going in using something like Elasticsearch and Kibana to actually access that data, and then we have fine-grained access. Now, of course, this is harder. This is harder than just a standard vanilla Broadworks system on a Linux server. You need regular log reviews. Providers are required to audit access logs typically every 60 days. If an employee accessed a healthcare tenant without a documented reason, that has to be detected and reported and managed. So your employees need to know that if they're accessing records of actual calls, that gives them access to protected health information, and you need to track that. And then there are procedures for breach notification. You need documented access. If there's a disclosure, you need to make certain notifications to the Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Health and Human Services. And a side note is even if a breach is just someone stealing your customer list to spam them with calls, not medical records, that's still a breach. It costs you money under HIPAA. It's really BAAs all the way down. So other PSTN providers, cloud services, transcription vendors, if they're touching protected health information, you need a BAA with them too. So it's kind of a recursive process. The covered entity, the medical provider, they sign a BAA with you, and then you sign with someone else. You can't outsource the obligation of doing some work, providing some services, or handling the data without outsourcing the agreement as well. And that's written in the BAA that you're going to do that. So what are the audit gotchas that people run into that catch providers off guard? You know, if you're providing for a third-party HIPAA audit, there's some specific failure points that come up repeatedly for VoIP providers. And they're easy to miss precisely because they feel like infrastructure details, but not compliance issues. But in reality, they are compliance issues. So one is claiming mere conduit status when you're doing more advanced data information services. For example, you're storing voicemail, you're storing recordings, you're doing CDRs. That exemption was written before unified communication existed, and it doesn't really apply to you. Voicemail accessible over unencrypted interfaces. So a classic thing is like you're downloading voicemail and it's accessible over IMAP format or plain HTTP. There's a common default configuration that needs to be hardened. You're required to not only store the protected health information in encrypted format, but you're required to transit across the network in an encrypted format. You need caller ID in plain text CDR exports to be encrypted where stored. So if you're storing CSV CDRs or XML CDRs, and those contain caller name, those files are unencrypted PHI sitting on the server. Your shared user accounts for accessing admin systems or stored data are also a problem. There's no individual accountability, and therefore there's no audit trail. So you can't tell who logged in as that admin user or that tech user. You could have logs that exist but are never reviewed. That's a problem. Having logs is not the same as having an audit program. The Office of Civil Rights wants to know that someone is actually looking at them, looking for problems. And another gotcha is that you have cases where you have access, but they have no documented rationale for that. If person A in job function X can view PHI, the auditor wants to see why in writing. There should be some rationale. So one practical note on infrastructure control. The rule of thumb is that you have to control where things are stored or have agreements with whoever is storing them. If you don't own and operate the infrastructure, it just got more complicated. You have to delegate responsibility to someone else, and they have to be willing to take the risk, buy appropriate cyber insurance, sign the agreements, that sort of thing. Internal storage running on flash arrays or SSDs that you operate with physical access controls and known access port paths is a straightforward option. It puts the covered entity in control. So instead of outsourcing, for example, your call recordings and your call transcriptions to someone else, it puts you in a better position to stand behind the BAA yourself rather than delegating it to someone else. The compliance dividend shows up when you see transcription as a monitoring tool. Here's something that often gets missed in the HIPAA conversation. Done right, call transcription doesn't just create compliance obligations, it creates compliance capability. Healthcare providers want to know what their staff are talking about on the phone. By doing transcription and then feeding the output into private models that are watching for specific topics, you can detect when conversations cross line that matter to the practice. You can take the same logic and turn it into this. The person on the phone who's making the appointment, are they giving medical advice? Are they crossing the lines in the compliance? These doctors and medical providers are responsible for the behavior of their employees on the phone. Real-time transcription combined with configurable alerting, keyword detection, sentiment analysis lets a practice manager get notified when a call flags for review without having to listen to hours of recordings, which is just totally infeasible. The same infrastructure that creates your HIPAA obligation can become one of your most valuable tools for managing your practice's own compliance. So ECG's Wingman is a platform that we built that can help you here. It's built specifically for this kind of environment. It provides call recording and AI-powered transcription that operates inside the service provider or the healthcare organization's own data center. So you've got a hospital chain, you've got a data center, you can put Wingman inside that data center. You can record and transcribe right there inside your own data center without sending the data to somebody else. The data lives entirely on your own servers, and it runs with AI models on the servers. That single design decision eliminates the most common HIPAA problem with transcription services that need to route PHI through an external vendor who may not sign a BAA. Within Wingman, data is segmented by tenant. Healthcare Orgs 1 CDRs and recordings are stored separately from Healthcare Orgs 2s because they really have two separate implementations, storing them at two separate places. The result is a service where you can actually stand behind when a healthcare customer asks, where does our call data go and who can see it? It's right there on that server in your own data center.